You tell me when to start. Following the instructions. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is Sophie El-Falaha. I'm the Executive Director of the CIMIA, one of the two centers of expertise of the GPAI. Welcome to this session called Can AI be Rights Preserving, Ethical and Still Unjust? So the session will engage the multi-stakeholder audience on how practically the recommendations of the Data Justice Policy Briefs that was recently published by the GPAI Data Governance Working Group could be incorporated into data policy and governance frameworks currently emerging all over the world. So this policy brief draws from two policy primers that were commissioned by the working group on social justice and economic justice and data. So these build on the substantive literature review and policy guides for policymakers, developers, and communities and users. So I'm very happy and honored to introduce you to our moderator and our panel for today. So Mr. Dewey Murdick, moderator for the session, is the director of the Centers for Security and Emerging Technology, CSET, at Georgetown University. Our panel are flagging that they don't hear me speaking, technically speaking, so perhaps we should also check with the audience. We also have as speakers Mrs. Alison Guildwall, Executive Director of Research ICT Africa, Mrs. Tina Park, Head of Inclusive Research and Design of the Partnership on AI, Parmandeer Jeet Singh, Executive Director of IT for Change, as well as Jamila Venturini, Co-Executive Director of Derechos Digitales. So welcome everyone to this interesting conversation, and I will leave the floor to Dewey for introducing the session and the discussion. Thank you very much.
I'm so sorry, we're not hearing any sound from the room. Can you hear us?
Very well. So I'll text them.
Hello.
Just to say that...
I was wondering if we could confirm that you can hear us. I'm so sorry, we were not able to hear anything from the room.
We hear you very well. Thanks,
okay.
WhatsApp, for the communication.
With that, I will trust that everyone can hear me. So welcome. My name is Dewey Murdick. I'm the director of the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. in the United States. I've been co-leading the Data Governance Working Group's Data Justice Project with Alison as a GPAI expert since spring 2021. Today we're discussing principles for designing just data governance strategies and the practical steps that policymakers can take to implement data justice. Over the last 18 months or so, our working group has been focused on advancing how data justice can be put into practice with three audiences: policymakers, developer communities, and impacted communities. We are really grateful for the support from GPAI and then also from the UK Office of AI, which has helped us to expand this work and go deeper with local partners from Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Oceania. You can find a wealth of resources at gpai.ai, including literature reviews, repositories, and a whole bunch of other documents. Today's conversation is going to focus primarily on a really nice distillation that has just been recently published, the policy relevant recommendations, just recently released in a policy brief. But before we get started in our discussion, I wanted to briefly introduce the panelists, and then we'll go from there. First of all, Dr. Alison Guildwall is the Executive Director of Research ICT Africa, based in Cape Town, South Africa, which is an African digital policy and regulatory think tank that works across 20 African countries. She is a GPAI expert and has been a driving force behind the Data Justice Project since it was first proposed in February 2021. Mr. Parmandeer Jeet Singh is Executive Director of IT for Change, based in Bangalore, India. His areas of work are ICT for development, internet governance, e-governance, and digital economy. He led the drafting of the primer on data and economic justice, which is also posted on the GPAI.ai website. Dr. Tina Park, thank you, is the head of inclusive research and design at the Partnership of AI. in San Francisco in the United States. She focuses on working with impacted communities on equity-driven research, frameworks, and methodologies to support the responsible development of AI and machine learning technologies. And last but not least, for sure, Jamila Venturini is co-executive director of Derechos Digitales, a Latin American-based nonprofit organization with headquarters in Chile that defends and promotes human rights in digital economy since 2005. Jamila is a journalist and researcher in social sciences. She's the author of books and papers on technology and human rights and a member of the Latin American Network on Surveillance, Technology, and Social Studies. With that introduction, I'm really excited to be able to start a discussion. To begin this discussion, I thought, Alison, if you could start, since you co-led this effort, if you could give a brief overview of the policy brief, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts here. Alison, you're muted. I can't hear you.
Apologies for that. You can hear me now?
Yes,
Great.
indeed.
So thank you very much, Dewey, and for everybody on the call for being here at different times of late and early hours of the day. The data justice policy brief really tries to surface some of the big policy questions that have been facing us and that we've been looking at in advancing this data justice work over the last 2 years. And it really tries to move beyond some of the initial work that was done in policy frameworks and regulation around mainly data protection, because largely still the collection and use of non-personal data remains almost entirely unregulated, and the effective implementation of many of the data protection frameworks are not possible in many countries. So the kind of notions of informed consent, with highly legalized documents, etc., don't really produce justice. And so though there have been a number of these ethical frameworks and rights-based frameworks that have been developing all over the world, there's increasingly kind of less consensus around how to deal with many of these issues. But I think what there is increasingly evidence of is the lack of justice coming out of these processes. Because they're ethical, because they're rights-based, do they necessarily produce just outcomes in highly uneven and unequal societies and between these societies? So really the purpose of this policy brief and of this work that we've been doing is to move beyond these initial efforts to achieve data justice, which was really concerned with basically first generation rights, quite individualized notions of privacy, and extend these to notions of collective rights and to notions of public interest outcomes and data justice. So, the concept has been studied extensively, but there's a kind of need now to really bridge this gap between the theory and practice of data justice, and to move it into the practical realm with these policy frameworks that are now also developing across the global south, and of course at the same time various parts of the global north which still are not haven't fully dealt with these issues. And so, what this work really tries to do is provide a more expansive approach to governing collective interest, common good. The work has been supported also by work looking at parallel forms of data stewardship that might produce more just outcomes. But currently, and also moving beyond notions of protection of data subjects only, but also to deal with issues of the uneven distribution of opportunities, not only harms, that accompany current data-driven policy frameworks. So it's really the shift from not purely protection of data subjects, but to the actual economic regulation that is required to protect people in terms of the uneven representation, the invisibility, the misrepresentation, and discrimination that one sees with the use of big machine learning data sets or artificial intelligence for decision making that's happening, but shifting it also from purely being subjects to actually getting opportunities to produce and create value out of data. And this really is, I think, what important part of what this work brings to the data justice debate is the need to, as I say, extend from these first generations to the second generations, but also to move from sort of compliance negative regulation, that is, that you've not breached anything, to more positive regulation that actually redresses imbalances that we see economically and, of course, socially. And this can really, only be dealt with when one also deals with the increasingly concentrated ownership of data and the ability for it to be utilized by these big monopoly platforms. A very small number, actually, globally, concentrated really in only 2 parts of the world. And this really, underscores this need to enable greater access and control over the resources of data between countries and within countries to deal with this unevenness, and to ensure that the capabilities and infrastructure that are required to utilize these effectively in countries. Simply a rhetoric on justice without the material conditions in order to do this will not allow for the redistribution of opportunities and benefits that we are all hoping to see out of these new, potentially, big solution building or solution opportunities that exist with these data-driven technologies. Thanks so much, Dewey.
Oh, thank you for the overview, Alison. It's a really a rich area of discussion, and we're going to get into it a little bit more. The neat thing about this goal, the work we did, it not only framed it, did a lot of literature to figure out what has been happening, but also started to provide very practical steps that governments, developers, and others can start to take. I think one of the most important elements here is the additional concept of economics. I firmly believe that economics will drive the implementation of any data justice or other types of data governance roles. And I just would like to turn to Parminder, if you could talk a little bit about how the economic regulations and incentives will essentially will connect these concepts, and what kind of practical policy actions that governments can take to ensure that these economic issues are considered in their data governance policies.
Thank you, Dewey. And I would take on from what Alison has been describing, and I'll just go a bit in the background of what economic justice is, and then come to what Dewey is asking about, what practical steps can be taken. So the primer has focused on producing some kind of first principles, the substrata on which policies can be based. And you can have policies of economic distribution which are utilitarian, which is just ethics based, or you can have them rights based. And we have tried to derive a rights basis for these policies. Everybody talks about data as being the most important resource in the digital age, and that then should be obvious that if data is the most important resource, the economic justice aspect would in some way be driven by the rights around that resource. And the fact today is that this resource is largely ungoverned in terms of economics. By default, whoever collects data takes almost all economic rights to it. Unfortunately, even in some laws, because they do not have a conception of how an economic governance framework should be shaped, the word data holder is being used as someone who has default rights. And I'm afraid with this kind of unthought of use of that word data holder, and without giving an economic governance framework around who has rights and how those rights are distributed, would entrench the default, which is that whoever collects data has all the economic rights. And why we need to do this is because people as diverse as Elon Musk and Sir Stephen Hawking, and I don't think we can have people more alike than these two, have said that AI is a force which could do really, kind of wipe out humanity, and all kind of things have been said because the Google CEO, Kai Fu Lee, who is a venture capitalist of China, but ex-Google AI head. All these people say that this AI is a very different kind of resource. It's so concentrated that we need to already start thinking about how we would ensure some kind of equity. So taking that seriously, and all AI is basically based on data, we need to allocate some kind of rights around data. So the effort is that since data, as Ellison was saying, the collective rights are important. The real economic benefit from data comes from the patterns in data. And that patterns in data is not a personal thing. It's not an individual thing. Individual data economically is not that useful. We should move away from that earlier age when it was just the personal data which was considered as the most important economic good. Today, it's the collective data from which AI is governed. And therefore, this collective data is a kind of a social resource which at a very fundamental level should belong to the community, and community should be able to use it. Now I come to the practical aspects. It's obvious that for economic productivity, different actors should have enough economic incentives. So starting from this default line where the society owns the intelligence about it, owns the data about it, allocation of rights to different producers, different producing agents, who may have collected data would arise. And this should go in this direction rather than the default being that all rights are with the data holders. From that default, we should chip at it. It's like the knowledge was considered a default of the society, but intellectual property rights initially for a very few number of years, but it's spun out of control. That's a different matter. Rights should be allocated to productive agents. And now I come to how practically this can be done. This also the primer talks about that use of these rights should be developed should be used for developing data infrastructures. In the industrial economy, there was some economic activities which were considered of infrastructural kind, and the businesses competed on the top of it. In the same way, we need to have data infrastructures in the area of health, in agriculture, in education, even commerce, which would help an equal playing field for businesses to operate. And after that, things may differ between different countries. Different countries would have a different digital industrial policies. They may want to promote certain kind of innovation more, may protect other public interest more, for example, in areas like education and health. And depending on that, the common aspect of data and AI may be accentuated, or more rights may be given to producers. So what would happen are two things. One, using those rights, data infrastructures are developed, which allow businesses to develop, and this should be placed in a larger digital industrial policy, and that would have many elements like industrial policies in the manufacturing age ahead, and I would not be able to go into those details. So these are my some initial thoughts.
Thank you so much, Parminder. So we've already started to hear about some of the need for some data-related infrastructure and some larger industrial policy questions that are that you just mentioned. I just want to step back one thing. So data governance is a really important aspect, and I was wondering if Tina, you could connect this concept of data justice to data governance. Why is this such an important concept when we think about data governance?
Yeah, I think a core part of governance is determining what we as a society prioritize and the values that drive our work. That includes what we're willing to address as social problems and the kinds of collective action and resourcing we want to provide in order to resolve some of those issues. And so I think prioritizing data justice in the context of data governance is important because of what's being elevated or prioritized. So that means, as Allison was mentioning, it's not just the impact on the individual, so our individual rights, individual harms, but thinking about collective well-being for the sort of body politic, right, in the social body. So it's not just about, is an algorithm creating a particular harm to just one person, but what are the implications of that when it is stacked or in sort of concert together. So a small issue actually becomes elevated to being a bigger issue because it's impacting a larger body of people. It has broader implications downstream. And so it has us thinking about different things. And of course, the emphasis on addressing and dismantling structural and historical inequality, so that, this is really key, right? It recognizes that harm and opportunities are shaped by historical and current dynamics, and that's happening both interpersonally, and it's shaped by, massive structures like governments and institutions, and taking that into consideration when we are thinking about the kind of technology that we're developing. I think for AI developers and researchers in particular, it's really helpful for them to reorient their thinking around, again, just as Allison was mentioning, not just the kind of harm that might emerge, but which is absolutely an important thing to be considering at all times, but also to think about how AI and other digital technologies can actually improve the lives of all people. So with this paradigm, I think it allows us to ask very different questions, including whether something should or shouldn't be built, and whether we should continue developing something if we realize that it does harm or it may not move us towards greater justice for marginalized people. So it has us thinking about, again, where are we prioritizing our efforts and our energy? And so it's such a core component of moving towards sort of more just data governance as well.
I really like how you framed it as not just a negative concept. It's really the concept of justice is a very positive and motivating concept, and connecting that like with where we're going rather than just, you mustn't do this, you mustn't do that. That's a nice way of thinking about data governance and how data justice brings a big motivation there. Jamila, you along with your organization, Derechos Digitales, has had such a rich experience working with governments to help them implement and other actors to help them implement practical questions in this digital area. I was just wondering if you could share some of your lessons learned and see how this lines up with how governments can implement these insights practically.
Of course, Dewey. First of all, thank you for the invitation and the questions, and congratulations to GPAI's Data Justice Project for this very valuable input. I guess the policy brief highlights key issues to be considered by governments, particularly the need to take into account the several layers of social and economic impacts of datafication in their policies, and Alison has already explored a bit of this. The rights-based approach, which we will continue discussing during this activity, is a fundamental element of such movement and demands a very high-level commitment to be successful. But I'd like to focus on another aspect that I believe should be of our attention, or attentions to governments, and particularly Global South governments, when we think about these issues. It is urgent, I believe, to rethink the development models in which we want to advance our economies. The human rights-based regulation, as my colleagues were mentioning just before, shouldn't limit itself to prevent or remedy harms from global data extractive industries, but set the basis for a sustainable innovation model that challenges the established global monopolies, as Alison was mentioning before. So besides creating an enabling regulatory environment for alternative forms of data use, investments on education and research should be prioritized if we want to build local capacities for a use that is grounded in local realities and the public good. Otherwise, we will continue to be trapped into other forms of dependency, maybe not at the development or the regulatory level, but in the terms of intermediary who will be able to process this data infrastructure, as Parminder was mentioning before. So this is definitely not a simple task, considering that data and databases are already concentrated in a few actors. But such investments have to be based on equity standards, since building innovation models that are just require allowing other narratives and other values to flourish, particularly the ones from groups who have been historically excluded from decision making and from the production of technology. As an example, only 28% of engineering and 40% of computer science graduates were women in 2021, according to UNESCO. And women and other gender minorities are among the groups mostly affected by discrimination through data processing in several forms. So it is urgent to foster a diverse tech industry and a diverse tech field with diverse experts, not only to produce, but also to assess and audit the systems that are implemented in our countries. And this should be a complementary step towards putting data justice into practice, I guess.
The field of the things that you just brought in are even more rich. So we've just talked about how the talent needs to be seriously considered. We need to make sure that the innovation systems are well thought out. We also need to do the protection and the safety elements here. So there's a bunch of complex interdependent parts that need to be considered when you're thinking about truly implementing just systems. So this is even more exciting. So the discussion is going to continue. I just want to take a quick break. For those who are online, I believe you can enter chat and answer a question and wow, I can't speak. Send us questions. So please try that. I'll be collecting them as we continue our discussion. For those who are in the room, as you're thinking of questions, please speak with or send the questions. Let Sophie Falaha know that she has questions that you want to ask. So we're going to continue the discussion, but while we're doing so, please think of these questions, and then we'll stop every little bit to make sure that we have an opportunity to engage discussions in the room. This is such a rich conversation. So while we're waiting for questions, I want to continue on. One of the main, one of the first actual findings in the policy brief was the recommendation that a rights-based approach to data governance be considered, both in terms of social and economic outcomes, and that this was a core way of thinking about justice as it relates to data governance and other aspects. What happened when we wrote that, soon after it was written and just before it was released on the website, the US released a blueprint for AI, an AI Bill of Rights. And it was quite exciting to see that some of the concepts that were in the recommendation were called out in that early document. It doesn't have any binding characteristics yet, but we noticed that there were some interesting elements in here. It's a notable step for the US and its context, with some implications for the rest of the world, but it's not the entire story. So I just wanted to talk to the panelists and ask what you think of the US version. Is it going in the right direction? Is there, what's right, what's missing in this concept of a rights-based approach to data governance? Tina, do you mind going first on this?
Yeah, I might be the only other American on this panel, so I'm happy to jump in. So I have to say, given the state of politics in this country, I'm actually very proud of these efforts. Like you said, it's the beginning, but I think we're making some really good progress. The AI Bill of Rights really reflects the understanding that AI systems are ultimately socio-technical. So, the approaches and solutions can't solely be focused on the technical fixes, trying to build a more accurate system or something like that. But recognizing that how the digital technology is developed, how those inputs for the AI systems are sourced and managed, and how they're deployed and inherently interacting with the community are all social processes that we are people who are creating systems. And so they're going to inherently have some of the biases and values that we care about. And so that we have to really be thoughtful about the kind of social impact these systems are going to have. So I appreciate the fact that, the core concepts that are defined and the way that it's discussed throughout the document really reflects that sort of duality. And I think what I also really appreciate is that it was drafted through a really participatory process where, civil society advocates like Partnership on AI were really welcomed into giving their input. And you can see those perspectives really reflected in the draft. I know there are a lot of people who aren't necessarily happy with it in terms of how far it pushes and, where the orientation and the focus is on which actions need to be taken. But I think, again, this is a really amazing place to start the conversation about AI governance. It sets us up really well to then have those harder conversations around how we actually go about operationalizing this and identifying the right regulatory mechanisms that we need to put into place to make sure that all of us, not just government, not just civil society actors, but industry partners as well, are aligned with some of these core values and priorities.
Thank you, Tina. I know I started out super skeptical when I started reading the document. I'm like, oh, great, we don't need another principles-based document that doesn't have any connection with practice. And as I was reading it, I was a bit more, I felt more and more positive as I read it. Obviously, there's a long way to go between ideals and practice, which is where the challenge is. But it was an interesting start. Alison, I was curious if you would weigh in on, like, from the perspective of Africa, or with the views, the engagements you're part of. What does this mean? Is this what's missing? Is it helpful to move the discussion forward? Is it not helpful? What do you think?
Thanks, Dewey. So, Dewey, I think coming from Africa, and I think amongst a lot of people that we've spoken to, stakeholders that we've spoken to, over many of these issues, both those that we absorb from Europe, but also from North America, particularly around cybersecurity and that kind of what's been seen as some sort of 9/11 policy laundering, across Africa and the global South. Any of these sort of blueprints or things are treated with some skepticism. And as you've said, I think there's been a very positive response actually to the blueprint on the AI Bill of Rights. I think there's there's a sense that it's provided some really important guardrails that data minimization, the privacy of by design, seeking consent from data subjects, some of the sort of things that are kind of given in some of the European legislation, but express deterrence on continuous surveillance in spaces such as work and housing, which I think is very important from a labor rights point of view. So I think there's generally a feeling that these, although they're high-level principles, though they're not enforceable, they're likely to have that sort of knock-on effect in other policy formulation elsewhere, and that these would be very positive in other environments that might not have had the resources or opportunities to give it this kind of thought, and and to have even this kind of influence if they did adopt these kinds of things. So obviously, when the US does this, this is has enormous impact on the rest of the world, and particularly on Africa. And so the importance of Africans have experienced considerable unevenness in discriminatory practices. So being amongst the most marginalized, they've really experienced that, and these could be further entrenched with the rollout of automated systems that are largely coming from, at a kind of a global level from the US and from China. And so the safeguards that are put into place in the US obviously play out in these global systems, and the emphasis on human rights, and this is a kind of standard in the US and in these big global systems that are operated from there, data-driven systems that are operated from there, will have significant implications, I think, in the global South. And I think it's generally been seen as quite positive, and questions around how it can be made kind of more enforceable, and ensure that these are put in place, especially outside of the US.
While we still have you, recognizing that you have the wonderful challenge of running off battery at the moment, did you want to? Are there other efforts other than the U.S. Effort that should be mentioned here? Are there any African efforts or any other things that we should be discussing?
Well,
I am so sorry. I think we lost Alison. I'm not sure if you're still there, but if we will come back when she's back. Harminder, would you take a take from India? Are there other things, what is your take on this? And also, are there other blueprints or frameworks that we should be thinking of other than just the US one?
Yes, I'll start from the US one. I think, and I agree with you, Dewey, that once you read, you look like a lot of good intention hidden or explicit in a lot of language there. And I think laying out the first ideas towards first principles is always a very useful exercise. And as Alison said, that's something which comes from the US in terms of the digital world is itself something which can have a huge impact. For example, I somewhere in the text did see the word have local control. That's very big. But after that, we need to figure out what does local control of AI mean, because that's a very complex, difficult, the very promising idea, and this is mentioned in those principles, and that those kind of things. So in that sense, it's a great document. But of course, everybody recognizes it's still a document of what should not be done, how harm is not caused, and ethics of applying AI. Not about distribution aspects of AI, which is the next step. And in any case, the document is great. So are the EU documents, which are taking the form of a legislation, which are again risk-based. All these things are good. Now, I'll briefly comment on what's the difference between a rights-based approach vis-a-vis a general approach which addresses a situational problem. Traders on Amazon are facing certain problems, and then a law comes and just plugs that gap. Rights-based things are important because they give greater force. They have a generalized application. And in the digital society, the changes are very fundamental. And I always think they are as fundamental as they happened at the advent of the industrial society. So a rights-based framework pushes things much further. Otherwise, AI being such a strong economic force, whatever you try to do comes up against the economic interests of those who hold AI, right? And soon those interests start being called as their economic rights, as happened in AI, IP. And a rights-based approach, therefore, gives the public authorities much better generalized basis to push harder and harder. And I was saying in my earlier intervention, AI is an outstandingly strong and concentrated force. In an earlier era, the control of manufacturing capacity, control of energy sources, control of the armament industry, these were physical things which reach a limit of reducing benefits because of the physical aspects, but not intelligence. Intelligence is such a thing which keeps on concentrating, and I am very sure AI engineers and people like you know what the nature of AI is. Now I'll come to what India is doing, and I've seen the South African strategy also. Most developing countries take a very strong application-centric approach. They talk about what AI can do in agriculture, what AI can do in health. They become cheerleaders for those changes which they really want to see happen in their countries, which is a very nice thing. But I think that kind of a thing has to be separated from what is actual regulation and actual lawmaking. So if I read Indian documents, there are a huge number of sections on what it can do for agriculture, for education, for health in Indian conditions, which is very good because it helps orient the government agencies towards an AI-based thinking, which does not exist. So that's largely the effect, an application-centric thing, whether in Africa or in India. But who owns AI, who controls AI, and things like local controls, these aspects have not started to be talked about, and I think they need to be talked about. One thing in India, there is an effort to understand that AI is, after all, based on availability of data. And there is a talk of developing data markets in one of the AI strategy documents from a think tank of the government. Some places it's also mentioned that some kind of data has to be infrastructural and be available for so-called social good, and therefore AI for social good can be produced. And then there is a report by a committee of experts, of which I was also a member, on non-personal data framework, which talks about certain kind of mandated data sharing of certain high public value data sets, which then can be used to develop AI in both a competitive manner by market players, but also by public players. So this is largely the state of debate in India.
Thank you so much, Parminder. Really appreciate that. Allison was not able to talk about the African Union Data Policy Framework that was recently laid out. And I think this is one of the benefits of GPAI because it allows us to see the global context of these questions. Jamila, I was curious if you could add anything else from the perspective of Latin America or other perspectives that you personally have.
Of course, I guess it's very interesting to see how this, how a human rights-based approach to these discussions are advancing in some context. It's interesting to see how this was not the case just a few years ago. So I believe the United States initiative is an interesting one from that perspective also, and for the influence it can have in our countries. In Latin America, in terms of the types of AI strategies that we see emerge, we have a scenario that is pretty much similar to what Parminder described in terms of the good intentions. And that's why in my first intervention I was mentioning it's not only about creating an enabling environment for the innovation on AI if you don't have a strategy for fostering the development or local development of these technologies, and under which values and under which ground you have that is the great question. Otherwise, it's just about opening space for global technology firms to continue to enter in our region. And they are entering in a very quick pace. Let's recall that Latin America is mostly a region that consumes technology rather than producing and exporting technology. So this is a particularity from the region, and that's why our concerns have been placed a lot in how governments are deploying technology, these data-intensive technologies. What we have seen until now, Dewey, is that when it comes to the deployment of data-intensive systems within the states, the governments have not prioritized the human rights-based approach. And we have analyzed the use of facial recognition systems, the implementation of artificial intelligence, the implementation of so-called COVID apps during the pandemic. In several countries, together with partners, we identified that in very few cases, this is preceded by human rights impact assessments, for instance, which are already recommended by some recommendations that we have published. And worse than that, we have identified how vendors who have been questioned for abuses in other regions or are even forbidden to operate in certain countries are successively advancing through direct contracts in the region. And that's not due to a lack of frameworks or a lack of strategies, besides the existence of several procurement and data protection rules that, although cannot respond to the full context that we are talking about in this conversation, they set some guidance on these activities. They are not being taken into account. But we also have an interesting framework that I'd like to highlight here that is based on the legality, necessity, and proportionality criteria for any restriction to the exercise of human rights. So we believe this is an interesting basis for a rights-based approach to regulating the use of such systems from a data justice perspective, because on the one hand, it allows some flexibility. On the other hand, it offers protection for people and communities. And let's consider that necessity and proportionality should be defined in dialogue with potentially affected groups or with concrete evidence that their needs are being taken into account in this balance. And just to mention, another regional development was made this year when during the Summit for Americas. And I guess it's pretty much aligned with the US strategies that you're mentioning. It is a digital transformation agenda, but it encourages innovation based on the respect to people with disabilities, respect to other groups which have been historically marginalized, discriminated against, or in vulnerable situations. It brings some commitments with equality when it comes to digital inclusion, the promotion of research and development of resilient and secure infrastructure, and with the respect of human rights among several other communities. And in this sense, I believe it summarizes a lot of what a just data governance agenda could look like. And I guess it's worth continue to follow how it evolves and these discussions evolves. Of course, as you were mentioning at the beginning, it's a challenge to see how this will look like in practice, but I believe it's also an interesting basis for continuing these dialogues. And it is interesting to see that there is some consensus in the region, in the Latin American, the Americas level, around how to move this forward.
Oh, this is great. Thank you so much. Each of you touched on major parts of both the effort that the U.S. tried, but now all around there's different efforts that are kind of interweaving together. And I think, Jamila, here at the end, you were just pointing out some really interesting discussion points about how it actually opens up to some of our participatory processes, contextualization discussions that were some other findings that we're going to, if we have time, we'll talk more about. But let me just pause for a second. Sophie, I don't know if there were any questions, and I just wanted to just pause for a second to see if there were any. If you're speaking, you're muted. We're not hearing anything.
No.
Okay, well, I'm going to take silence as please continue with the discussion. And if there are questions, we do look forward to them. One of the other, and I'm going to kind of, since we're low on time, I want to put these two together. Two of the next findings that were really important was in the policy brief was the need to move beyond a one-size-fits-all solution. So how something looks, how a solution looks in Senegal will look different than it does in Brazil or in Bangalore or other areas, and just recognizing that the data justice concept requires both the understanding of the context in which it's being deployed, but also the participatory process of finding the right stakeholders and listening to them and making sure that it's done in a way that actually brings out the insights that are necessary. I'm really interested in lessons learned that each of you have and how to take both the context into place and then also appropriately listening to stakeholders. I don't know, Tina, would you like to go first on that?
Sure, happy to jump in. So at Partnership on AI, a lot of our work engages practitioners, so the people who are actually developing the AI technology, whether that's at a private company, in government, or within sort of these not-for-profit and university research centers. And so what I'm about to say may seem very basic or obvious, but it's also very surprising how often I don't see it in practice and across these different spaces. So first of all is that we have to acknowledge that understanding that complexity and especially the way that power and authority are organized there and how that sort of manifests itself in the interactions we have, whether that's through the development process or through these public engagement processes, it takes expertise. And when I say expertise, that means, it can be formally acquired through education, or it can be informally acquired through, direct experience and engagement. So both are incredibly important in these contexts, and we should value both when we're thinking about the kind of expertise we want to bring in to help us be better informed about the local context. I think second, we have to admit that a lot of our teams, whether that's on the policy side or the development side, we don't actually have a lot of that expertise built in, or we don't consider that as an important feature to have when we're building out the teams that we want. Again, when it comes to AI and digital technology, we tend to focus a lot on, can we bring the technologists in? Can we get the people with technical expertise in without necessarily thinking about, are we engaging locally based community leaders, advocates, organizers, or people who have spent a significant portion of their lives like studying those social dynamics of a locale or a particular community. And so making space and making them integral parts of the teams is really, really important, that they have as strong a voice to shape the outcome as much as, say, a technical advisor would. This is especially true for the practitioners that we work with that are headquartered or primarily based in the West. We also emphasize like when they need to work in direct collaboration and partnership with the local practitioner. So when we're talking to some of our large tech partners, that means like take advantage of the fact that you have regional offices and regional practitioners and have been able to do some local hiring. So again, that they have as loud and important as a voice as some of your Western-based project managers or organizational leaders. That dynamic of power has to be shifted so that those locally based experts can have a role in shaping the direction. We can't really continue that age-old practice that we've had, unfortunately, of parachuting teams in from the US or Western context and dropping them into a location and thinking that they can figure out the dynamic within a week or two. It's not really possible. So those nuances are not going to come out and you're likely to make bigger mistakes. And the other thing that I want to point out and that you've been emphasizing is that these practices aren't scalable. I think we oftentimes think that we can see what's happening in one location and replicate it in its entirety somewhere else. And that's really difficult. I think what we can think about it, the way that we can think about it instead is that what we learn from those experiences and examples from across different contexts as a source of inspiration to then help us think about what pieces we can pull out that apply versus what we need to set aside because those situations are a little bit too different. This is really important for situations like the United States, where we have policy making around AI and digital technology happening at really different levels of governance. So from small cities to the federal government are all chiming in right now, trying to come up with regulations and guardrails for their citizens. But what we have to remember is that what happens at a particular level may not be scalable and replicable for a entirely different context. And we have to think about what we're giving up versus what we're gaining as we're trying to develop those things out. So I'm seeing a lot of really incredible actions being taken at a hyper local level. So cities are doing much more engaged processes. They're working with community organizers to really do more community-based workshops to inform the public about their digital rights. But that high touch, high engaged practice may not work at a federal level or even a state level. So we have to think about what do we gain versus what's going to ultimately be missing, and what are the different strategies we can use to work around that.
Thank you so much, Tina, for the lessons you've been learning in this area of contextualization and stakeholder. Jamila, do you mind adding a little bit extra view from what you've been experiencing in both how to get participatory processes and then how to actually appropriately contextualize data governance and data justice elements?
Of course. I guess we can all agree that we need some global consensus around some of these issues, precisely for what we were discussing before in terms of the inequalities, the global inequalities regarding development and the impact that some interests in industries have in different regions. But from a policy perspective, I believe it's key to think about mechanisms to identify how prepared the country is to implement some particular solutions. Something interesting in this direction was proposed by the UNESCO recommendations on AI, which is a readiness tool that could be interesting to see how they operationalize in terms of analyzing how ready is a country to implement or to advance, in that case, the recommendations. In our case, thinking about data justice agreements that we're thinking. Of course, we don't want to make countries hostage of some foreign regulatory models that can be difficult to implement in fragile democracies or in a context of resource scarcity and like the ones that we are facing in Latin America right now. We're thinking about how can we be effective, but at the same time, how can we avoid creating huge bureaucracies that have their own difficulties to implement certain laws, certain norms. At the same time, I guess, besides the need to participate in the global decision-making spaces on this area, something that's not necessarily happening right now, with some few exceptions, at least when we think about AI, we have in Latin America very valuable knowledge to mobilize as we operationalize some general principles. And I would mention a history of building institutional participatory processes in different fields and regulation for the protection of collective rights that could be of inspiration for this contextualized implementation of data justice principles. But from a more pragmatic perspective, I believe we will have to prioritize some areas for regulation in Latin America, considering what I mentioned before of us being a region that mostly consumes technology, different from North America, different from some Asian countries, for instance. So establishing some strict rules for government deployment of technology could be an interesting starting point. And following the recommendations again from the UNESCO, maybe mandating human rights impact assessments prior to the implementation of automated decision-making systems at the government level is something we believe it's urgent, considering the potential individual and collective impacts of these systems to historically marginalized groups, including people who are not fully or not even partially included in connectivity. So I'm thinking about social welfare programs that are being mediated by this program, by these systems. I'm talking about health programs that are being mediated by these systems and with very little transparency and knowledge by people who are being subjected to these intensive data extraction practices. So I guess this is going to be very urgent in Latin America as a first step to thinking about data justice. And just some to mention a bit on participation, I guess what we have analyzed already shows a very deep relationship between governments and the private sector, which I think reflects a bit of this power imbalances that we were discussing just now regarding which sectors have more access to decision making in certain areas. We have found systems or public documents around the implementation of certain systems that had literal extracts of press releases from companies, and that's not something that is very rare in the region. So it's very urgent to think about how do we bring others to the table in a meaningful way. And I guess, again, the digital divide is a key element to be taken into account. I guess our governments, at least in Latin America, have some of them at least naturalized putting some online consultations, but not necessarily doing active campaigns for other groups to be included in campaigns that have to be direct to different publics in different languages, that have to be accessible for people with disabilities, that have to be done in different media so they can reach rural and remote areas that are mostly disconnected in several countries. So this is something that is also urgent if we think about participation and meaningful participation, and also to have transparency and accountability about how the inputs of all participants are actually being taken into account in decision-making processes. And I would just like to finalize saying that we really have to think about mechanisms in which people have the possibility to say no to certain developments, people and communities. I guess there is a strong consensus being built around the need to develop moratoriums or bans into some technology that are already identified that as harmful, human rights harmful. So I believe this is something that has to be taken into account when we think about participation for the decision making around implementing or not certain systems.
Thank you so much. You really covered a lot of important details. You got into the power balance issue. You got into a bunch of different, making sure everyone has access to the forums that you're trying to create. And there's a lot of really good stuff. Did you want to say something, Tina?
Yeah, I just want to jump in really quickly and say, Jamila, everything you're talking about is also absolutely applicable to industry practitioners as well, the developers who are creating these technologies, that they also have to go through their own transformation to, in some ways, slow down how they do their development so that they can take in that public stakeholder and public engagement feedback at all stages of development, and have those moments when they can maybe decide, like, the public is telling us that there's too much harm, or this isn't addressing a need that they have. We should maybe pivot away from this project. So all of those great things that you've just mentioned, I think, are lessons also for our practitioners to keep in mind, and figure out as well.
Great. Parminder, would you like to add anything about stakeholder communities or about contextualization, local application, or anything final thoughts?
Yes, I think, of course, I agree with both Tina and Jamila. And I will take on from what Jamila was saying, that we do need global principles and global basis. And it's nice to say that participation should reach all rural areas and far-flung areas, but we need to do something with AI and AI discourse first for that participation to happen. In the package as AI comes now, it's very difficult for even us to fully understand about what does participation, local control mean in it. So we have to then do something to that thing before we take it into a participation process. And as I was sharing with these people in this group, I'm from right now going for a consultation with farmer leaders on digitalization, and we'll be talking a lot on AI. And what we are going to do is, I think, first thing, we need to separate the technical from the social. Other thing Jamila also talked about, companies come, and every country thinks that I do not have a technological expertise, and therefore Microsofts and Amazons have to come. And I'm very happy they come. But technology is technical, one part, but data and AI are social constructs. They are not technology. We need to separate what is technology as technology from data. Data is a pattern in people's life. There's nothing technical about data. Neither intelligence derived from data is technical. These are social artifacts. We have to separate it. This is local, that is global. I don't have a problem using anybody's technology, but don't take my data, mix it up into one thing and say this whole is technical and therefore mine. I want to separate that. Data is mine, intelligence is mine. The combination is needed for it to be productive. It's like raw material have to be combined with machines to produce goods, but they're two different things. If you're using my oil, using your mining equipment, they're two different things. I get royalty on my oil, right? So separate data as a social artifact, AI as a social artifact. These are local. Let technology be global. Let technology companies come, but separate the other part. Within technologies, and this will happen if we do the separation, there are different concepts: federated AI, federated learning, local controls. Increasingly, we talk of AI, edge AI. If there can be edge AI, why can't there be local AI? And this can only be done from increasing the local political controls. The company won't do it. Company wants to make money. Company homogenizes. It's cheapest for it to homogenize, decreases its marginal costs, and increases the marginal revenue simply by homogenizing things. It increases the cost to make things different. Therefore, the socialization should therefore go to the political thing. And last part on contextualization, finally, it's everyday politics. Since AI is going into every aspects of it, my appointments with the salon, my gardener coming or not, my education, kids' education, everything. Therefore, everyday political choices about these fields are what everyday political choices about AI are. And in that context, the different societies would make different decisions. Now, Europe has come up with a health data space regulation, very extensive regulation, which almost socializes complete health data of Europe. It's an outstanding regulation. Therefore, it also socializes the AI. And that would be different from US, where the private sector in health is strong. Some people would socialize education and therefore socialize education AI. Others won't. Small countries may want to emerge as competitive centers and keep everything open. So that bring socialization to AI and then bring politics to AI is the only way to localize it.
Oh, that was excellent. So we've come up on 60 minutes in our discussion. Thank you so much for that final point. Very, very important to hear. Read the report. It's online. We've only covered a few of the findings in our discussion today. Let's continue the conversation. There is so much work to do here, and we've only begun. So thank you very much for each of our speakers. Also, thank you to Allison, who was hit by a power outage and unable to continue. But thank you so much, and looking forward to continuing the discussion and looking forward to the rest of the GPA event. Thank you. I'll hand it over to Stephanie.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.